Imagine waking up to the news that a president has vanished overnight. No tanks on television, no long war, just a knock in the dark and the leader of a sovereign country is suddenly standing in a courtroom thousands of miles away. That is what happened in Venezuela. And if you live in Taipei or Beijing or Washington, your heart probably skipped a beat, because history is shaped not only by what happens, but by what appears possible. I'm Fareed Zakaria, and today I want to talk about a single American military operation that lasted hours, but may echo across the Taiwan Strait for years. Was this about Venezuela, or was it a quiet demonstration of power, capability, and intent? If you care about Taiwan's future, China's calculations, or how global rules are being rewritten in real time, stay with me. This is not a story about legality. It's a story about power and perception. And to understand that, we need to step back and define the real question at the heart of this moment. To see why this matters, we have to be precise about the question we are asking. The question is not whether the United States violated international law in Venezuela. Many legal scholars believe it did, and China has been quick to say so. The real question is this: what does a successful, lightning-fast regime decapitation tell other great powers about the modern use of force? China has long watched Taiwan through a very specific lens, not as an international dispute, but as unfinished domestic business. Beijing does not measure its Taiwan strategy primarily against global opinion or UN resolutions. It measures it against capability, timing, and risk, especially the risk of American intervention. That is why comparisons to Venezuela surfaced immediately on Chinese social media, and why Chinese officials rushed to shut them down. Not because the analogy is accurate, but because analogies shape imagination. And in geopolitics, imagination often precedes action. To understand how we arrived at this point, we need to look backward at history, power imbalances, and the long shadow of unresolved conflicts. To understand Beijing's thinking, we need to go back not years, but decades. China's claim over Taiwan predates the modern international order. It is rooted in civil war, unresolved sovereignty, and a belief that time, not compromise, will eventually deliver reunification. That history matters because it explains why China treats Taiwan differently from every other foreign policy issue. Beijing does not see cross-strait relations as international relations. It sees them as an internal political problem to be managed, pressured, and, if necessary, resolved by force. Over the years, China has refined a strategy of coercion without open war. Military drills, air incursions, economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, all of it designed to squeeze Taiwan without triggering a direct American response. At the same time, the balance of power has been shifting. China's military has grown larger, more sophisticated, and more confident. Taiwan, by contrast, has relied on deterrence and on the promise that the United States would not stand aside. This unresolved tension is the background hum of East Asian geopolitics, and it sets the stage for the first real shock to the system. The shock came suddenly and far from Asia. In a single night, the United States demonstrated something many countries feared, but few had seen so clearly: the ability to remove a head of state with speed, precision, and near total control. No prolonged bombing campaign, no drawn-out invasion, just a decapitation strike, and Nicolas Maduro was gone. For observers in Beijing, this was not about Venezuela's politics. It was about method. If the world's most powerful military could neutralize a hostile leader in a distant, defended country quietly and decisively, it forces uncomfortable questions about readiness, about response time, about whether warning signs even matter anymore. China's official voices were quick to dismiss comparisons to Taiwan. They called the analogy false, legally irrelevant, politically absurd. But dismissals often reveal anxiety, because even when leaders deny parallels, military planners still study them. They look at timelines, They look at intelligence dominance. They look at how quickly allies mobilize or don't. If you're finding this analysis useful, take a moment to stay with the channel, because what looks like a one-off crisis is actually exposing something much deeper. And that brings us to the system beneath the spectacle, the mechanisms most people never see. What the Venezuela operation really exposed was not bravado, but architecture. Modern power no longer announces itself with massed armies. It operates through intelligence fusion, command and control dominance, and the ability to paralyze an opponent before they can even decide how to respond. This is the hidden mechanism at work. The United States did not need to defeat Venezuela's military. It needed to bypass it, to see everything, to move faster than reaction, to strike the political center while the defensive perimeter still believed it was intact. That distinction matters enormously for China, because Beijing's strategy toward Taiwan has always assumed time. Time to escalate, time to signal, time to deter Washington through ambiguity. But decapitation operations collapse time. They turn escalation ladders into trapdoors, and they expose a deeper vulnerability: dependence on systems rather than resilience. Weapons are only as strong as the networks that coordinate them. Defenses only matter if they can be activated before the moment passes. This is why Venezuela matters not as a precedent, but as a proof of concept. And once that proof exists, it invites a second, far more unsettling test. The second test was not hypothetical. It was technical, and it was quietly devastating. For years, Chinese-made weapons had been marketed and believed to be credible counters to Western military dominance. Venezuela was their showcase. Air defenses, radar systems, command infrastructure, nearly all sourced from China, and yet, when the moment came, they did not slow the operation. They did not complicate it. They did not visibly matter. For analysts in Taiwan, this detail landed with force. If Chinese systems could not deter or disrupt an American strike in Venezuela, what would happen under direct pressure in the Taiwan Strait? The question cuts both ways. For Beijing, it raises doubts about whether its military modernization has reached the level it believes. For Taipei, it offers a grim reassurance that American dominance, at least for now, still carries real weight. This is how deterrence actually works. Not through speeches, not through doctrine, but through demonstrated performance under real conditions. If you're watching this from Taiwan, you are not thinking about ideology. You are thinking about survival. And that brings us to the most human dimension of this crisis, the one that statistics and strategy can't capture. If you live in Taiwan, this is not an abstract debate. This is not about great power theory or military charts. This is about whether your life continues as it is or changes overnight. You watched what happened in Venezuela and asked a quiet, terrifying question. Could that happen here? You saw how fast it unfolded, how little warning there was, how a country went to sleep with a president and woke up without one. Some in Taiwan took comfort. They saw American capability as reassurance. Others felt exposed, because reassurance and dependence are separated by a thin, dangerous line. One Taiwanese voice put it bluntly: survival is not about provoking your protector. It's about unity, legitimacy, and not becoming a problem too costly or inconvenient to defend. This is where geopolitics becomes personal, because deterrence is not only built by weapons, it's built by cohesion, credibility, and public resolve. If this perspective resonates with you, pause for a moment. Share it, because the more people understand how power really works, the harder it becomes to be blindsided by it. And once you zoom out, you see something even larger taking shape beyond Taiwan, beyond China, beyond any single crisis. Zoom out far enough, and Venezuela is no longer the story. What we are really witnessing is the erosion of a system that once restrained power, the international rules-based order, not because it was perfect, but because it created predictability. The speed with which Western leaders avoided condemning Washington's actions matters. So does the hesitation. So does the silence. For Beijing and for Moscow, the lesson is not moral. It is structural. When rules bend for the strong, they lose their deterrent effect on the ambitious. When enforcement depends on alignment rather than principle, norms become negotiable. China's response was revealing. It condemned the operation loudly. It supported an emergency UN Security Council meeting, not because it expected reversal, but because it understands that narrative is now a battlefield. At the same time, Chinese planners are recalibrating quietly, not asking whether the US was right, but asking how far Washington is willing to go and how fast. This is how global shocks propagate, not through declarations of war, but through revised assumptions. And those revised assumptions point directly toward the future and the narrow paths now available. When systems are stressed like this, the future does not unfold in a straight line. It branches. I see three possible paths ahead. The first is deterrence holding. China concludes that the risks of action remain too high, militarily, economically, politically. American capability, Taiwanese resilience, and regional alliances combine to freeze the status quo. Tense, unstable, but intact. The second path is slower and more dangerous. Gray zone pressure intensifies, blockades rehearsed, cyber disruptions normalized, psychological warfare becomes routine. No invasion, but no peace either. A long squeeze designed to exhaust Taiwan without triggering a decisive response. The third path is the one everyone denies and prepares for. A miscalculation, a moment when speed outpaces diplomacy, where belief in quick, decisive action collides with another power's refusal to step aside. History tells us that wars rarely begin with consensus. They begin with confidence, which is why this moment matters so much. Because Venezuela was not about the past. It was about testing assumptions about the future. And once assumptions change, behavior follows. That leaves us with one final question, not for governments, but for all of us. Power always reveals itself before it explains itself. What happened in Venezuela was not just an operation. It was a signal sent not in words, but in capability. For Taiwan, the message is sobering but clarifying. Security does not come from outrage. It comes from preparation, legitimacy, and unity. For China, the lesson is more complicated. Strength is not only about how much force you possess, but how certain you are that it will work when tested. And for the rest of us, this moment forces a harder truth. The world is moving away from rules that restrain the powerful toward a system where speed, perception, and decisive action matter more than precedent. That does not mean war is inevitable, but it does mean that ignorance is dangerous. If you want to understand how today's small crises shape tomorrow's big decisions, stay with this conversation. Subscribe. Share this analysis and watch closely, because the next signal may not come with warning. This story isn't over. It's just begun.